Welcome to today's episode of the NicoleB Show, where the truth comes with no filter, no fear, and no allegiance to power. It's time to join me as we flip the script. Right. Welcome back to today's episode of the NicoleB Show. And thank you for joining us for another thought-provoking episode. Today, I'm honored. In fact, I'm ecstatic to be talking to someone who brings both personal experience and deep historical insight to the table. Today, I'm chatting to Shane Brody. Shane is not only a close friend, we were at university together, but also the author of a new book, South Africa, A Land Divided. Powerful and eye-opening account that explores the history of settler families, land, and politics in South Africa. His work delves into the complex and often painful legacy of our country's past, and it gives a voice to the stories that are so often overlooked, and a lot of our history that has been incorrectly retold. But Shane's connection to this history isn't just academic. It's deeply, deeply personal. But today we'll be talking about land, memory, trauma, and resilience, and how South Africa's past continues to shape its present, and how if we don't understand it properly, we're not going to have a future. Shane, over to you. Just a question is, what motivated you ultimately to write this book? Because I do know from having chatted to you that it's taken almost 6 years.
Right. Nicole, thank you very much. It was about, I would guess, about 8 or 9 years ago. I wanted to record my family history. So what actually transpired was that I was acting as a project manager for a foreign donor organization that wanted to assist in the former homeland regions to assist communal farmers. So having had vast experience in farming, they actually approached me. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to write a book, not only about my family, but about what I see at the time and what I saw about the entire homeland system. And as I went on, to do the work which I was doing, I was empowering different groups of farmers. It was actually quite a big project. It involved about 9 villages, but the region encapsulated about 45 villages in what is known as the Harewood district of the former Ciskei region. So during the course of my work, I saw all of these farms that I could have imagined were once very grand farms, with fantastic infrastructure, massive old homes, or what was actually left of the infrastructure in the massive old homes. And I started to talk to guys that farm there, and I began to weave a narrative together about what had happened in the past and what the future looks like. I'm not certain if that makes sense, but
It does.
Yeah, it was a very volatile, let's say, time in our history when the homeland system was formed. It created a lot of problems, and it's a very, very complex situation. It's not something that is easily explained because it could come across as being incorrect, it could come across as being wrong. But I think just prior to me getting onto that, which I'll get more onto in our second interview, so what I did is that it's actually quite important for folk to understand exactly where they come from. Modern children and modern people don't really care what their roots are, where they come from, what's actually molded them, what has actually made them into what they are. And, in many, many modern narratives, you hear about the importance of education. You hear about the importance of, getting a degree in maths or in science or, doing well in those subjects because these are the subjects which are going to help you in life. And I'm not disputing that fact that those are very viable subjects to actually study because, I mean, we're at the cutting edge of technology at the moment. We are living in a world where tech is going to mold what our future looks like. But I think that a lot of people and a lot of countries have put history on the back burner. And if you don't understand your history, a point which I raise in my book, I say that how do you fix a country when you don't know what broke it? So it is a very, very emotive, complex, difficult subject, to actually talk about and to get into because it can be viewed in the wrong way. So what I did is that I went and I researched firstly my history. I didn't know it was probably, I would say more than likely only about 10 years ago that I found out that I came from 1820 settler stock, on my mom's side, on my maternal side. There was also a little bit of Dutch influence there. Some of these settlers married into Dutch families. I then worked out that some of them were Irish. So I went into the Irish history. Then I worked out that there was also a little bit of German influence there. I also went into my father's line and I worked out that we were actually from Jewish stock, Lithuanian stock.
Lithuanian
On
Jews,
his
yes.
father's side. On his mother's side, it was all Dutch and German. So when I looked at all this, I thought to myself, but this is like a melting pot. I mean, this is like extremely hard to work out, because when you are raised, you're almost raised in a certain type of a cultural setting. You're either English or you're Afrikaans or you're French. And if you live in France, as an example, and both your parents were French, it's quite easy to understand your history. But being raised in South Africa, I think a lot of people will agree with me that there was a very big rift between the English and the Afrikaans when I was a young teenager. And I would think that a lot of that came from the aftermath of the Anglo-Boer War. The Afrikaans, or let's call them the descendants of the Dutch, had a sort of a bad feeling about the English. And that almost overspilled into our lives. I can recall in Queenstown, where I grew up, you would go to town and there'd be groups of Afrikaans boys and groups of English boys. And there was like this major animosity. Yeah. It was like we had an Afrikaans high school and I went to Queens, which is a very old and well-known boys' school. It is actually the fourth oldest school in South Africa, which I mention a lot in my book. And, we just had this like animosity. And obviously at the same time, we had this animosity because of the apartheid system. So we had black folk that were living under apartheid. We had accusations that the English, had oppressed the Afrikaans, and and then the Afrikaners came to power in 1948. And obviously, many English then were concerned that they were going to come under the hammer, of an Afrikaner community that may want to do a bit of, retribution. And I think
Well,
that retribution
I think we did. Sorry to interrupt, Shane, but I
yes.
do think we did come under a little bit of that retribution because we really
Yes.
weren't welcome in the state. I mean, my uncle worked for the Department of Labor, and he was never
Yes.
promoted above a certain level, even though he was
Yes.
exceptionally good at what he did. But he was never able to
Mm.
rise the ranks because he wasn't Afrikaans; he was Pukka English. So there was
Yes.
that. There was definitely that sort of you're English and you work for us, but we're never going to go anywhere. So they did definitely get that sort of revenge in terms of keeping us out of the state sector. And now the ANC's done the same thing. Role reversal.
Yes. So, like I say, Nicole, why I raise that point is that we seem to live in a country where retribution is always there. It's always lurking in the shadows. And it is just something that I try to work through and try to work out, why is this the case? I looked at what happened to the Afrikaners in the Boer War, and then I started piecing things, together and working out that the narrative isn't always what you are told it is. And I'm going to explain more in detail what I mean. Is that we had this feeling, that it was now the chance of the Afrikaner. In the aftermath of the Anglo-Boer War, it wasn't many years. I think it was about 15 or 16 years, and then the Afrikaners took control of the country again. And, there was obviously this feeling amongst the English community that, retribution could be a factor. Like what occurred in 1994 when the ANC took over. I think a lot of white folk felt that, what was going to happen to us. And a lot of people left the country at the time.
Hmm.
So I started looking more into this thing in a sort of a philosophical way, and a way that my history and what I'd worked out about my own history, started to illuminate a picture that helped me to understand where these feelings come from. And I don't want to get too, let's say philosophical now, but I think it's important for people to understand these things, because what I worked out, I was about 14 years old and I loved reading. I'm a columnist, for agricultural magazines at the moment. I write advice columns mostly for emerging farmers and for communal farmers. So I've always had a love, to read, and how can I say, to explore more, about the world around me. And if I look at modern kids, they don't really want to know what's happening around them. They're interested in their laptops and their tablets and their whatever. So I used to each Sunday morning go to our veranda at home, because we lived in town, although my father was a farmer. He owned a few farms around Queenstown. But my mother didn't ever feel safe, even in those years, living on a farm. So I would go get the Sunday Times, which got thrown onto our front veranda every Sunday morning. And I flipped through a few of the pages, and there was a big photograph of my grandfather. And I looked at this and I thought, but that's weird. And the headline was something to the effect of Afrikaner nationalism 1941. So I was quite shocked about this. I was probably about 13 or 14 at the time. And I went to my parents and I said, but what's this all about? And they said, oh, well, we've never ever told you about it, but your grandfather, who came from English stock, from like my 1820 settler stock, along, let's say, like a very proud line of that. He had joined the Ossewa Brandwacht, which was an Afrikaner nationalist organization in the early 40s. It was started, I think, in the 1930s. But so I read the whole story, and the story was that he had joined this Afrikaner nationalist organization while he was a cop at Marshall Square in Joburg. He was probably at that stage in his late 20s or early 30s, and it's a very fascinating story because he jumped Hannes van der Walt, who was an Afrikaner folk hero, out of prison. And at the time, there were actually thousands of underground cops who were part of the Ossewa Brandwacht. So eventually, he made out that this guy was a wrestler. Hannes van der Walt was a very big, strapping guy. They concocted the story that Hannes van der Walt had overpowered him when he went to check him in his cell because he had been arrested, for his Ossewa Brandwacht activities. And they concocted the story that Hannes had overpowered him and had got the key for the cell. But what actually transpired was that my grandfather had jumped him out of prison. So this whole narrative was written in a book called Vervolken Führer, which sounds very, very pro-Nazi type of a book, if you know
I
what I
was just
mean.
going to say, very
Yeah,
uber German. Here we go. Yeah.
Yeah, which didn't really ring well with part of my father's
Don't.
family because we had Jewish heritage, so
Yes.
it was a
Must have been
melting pot.
complicated at home.
Yeah, it was like a melting pot. It was like a cauldron. I mean, a cauldron is something where you've got instability and you've got insecurity and you've got emotion. So I started to think about this, how could my grandfather have done that? I mean, was he a pro-Nazi? No, I mean, I had this Jewish family, and so he was alive at the time when I read this article, and I actually went to speak to him and I said, but why did you do this? So he said to me that it was all about what the English had done to the Afrikaners. And obviously, a lot of his friends at the time were Afrikaner cops. And they had obviously given him a little bit of an indoctrination and, told him how bad things were for them, which they were bad. I mean, I actually mentioned that in my book. I mean, it was almost like a genocide. So I then started to think to myself, but, all these narratives that we are told in our society, and we almost like compartmentalized. If you're English, you've got to believe in this. You've got to believe that Cecil John Rhodes was a good guy. If you're Afrikaans, you've got to believe that, Verwoerd was a good guy and Foster was a good guy. If you are Xhosa, you've got to believe that Madiba was a good guy. If you're Zulu, you've got to believe that Shaka was a good guy. And that's how we go. We almost put into these boxes. And we are told that, this is right and that's wrong. So I looked at this cauldron or this, melting pot in my family, and I started to think to myself, but, isn't there more to history than what we are told? When I was growing up in junior school, a lot of our history was Afrikaner history. It was about Dirkie Eis and Rachelkie de Beer and Voorraad Woltemade. And a little bit about, the Second World War, and a little bit about the First World War. So I started working out that, our youth are like putty in our hands. We can mold them. We can tell them that this was our history and it's the right history. And in South Africa, we've got a very, very strong sort of a socialist, communist type of a feel to our body politic at the moment. Not on all sides of the spectrum. I mean, you've got your groups like the Freedom Front, and you've got the DA, which is a centrist organization. You've got your far right, you've got your far left. And, I started thinking to myself, Nicole, that, our youth is told today that the salvation of the country is in land, quote unquote. Which is why I mentioned in my book, one of the chapters is about land and about what a divisive sort of a topic this is. And then I started thinking to myself, a person who's been a farmer for 35 years now and who knows quite a lot about farming, I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but I've done quite a few courses in farming. So I understand what the intricacies are. And we'll go more to that in the second interview, but I just want to lay the foundation for what is going to come in the second interview.
Yes.
So, we are told that, the salvation of the country is in this land issue. It's in this fact that we don't have land, so, we're never going to make headway. But I can tell you, if you look at the facts of which we'll go deeper into in the next one, I'm just going to mention one factor now that in 1990, we had about 120,000 commercial farmers in South Africa. We've got about 40,000 left. I think the figure is probably closer to about 35,000. And there's a reason for that. And that reason is hardship.
Yeah.
Is that what a lot of people don't understand is that not all commercial farmers in this country are wealthy, big, what they call the mega boere. These guys that are billionaires and they fly around in private planes. 80% of our farmers are regarded as being small to medium scale of our commercial farmers. So as I say, I don't want to say too much about that now, but coming back to what I was explaining about history. So I went and I looked at what happened in the history of the Eastern Cape, which, as I say, was a cauldron. It was a place of volatility. It was a place of frontier wars. I mean, the frontier wars lasted 100 years, which is a long time. It's not as though it was a little skirmish like the British had with the Zulu, over a year or two, and then it was over. This was a systematic process of acrimony, of war, of land, of territory, of aspirations for land. So I went and I looked at why my ancestors would have come to South Africa. What would have made them leave England or Britain to come to a place that they knew absolutely nothing about. A place very, very different. I mean, you are now living in the UK. You've lived in South Africa. I think you know what the differences are just in terms of the weather.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Culture,
Yeah.
vastly different.
The culture
I've
and the
lived in a few
topography.
countries in Europe. The culture's not even the same. Forget the weather. The people aren't the
Yeah,
same or anything like that.
yeah,
The British, they're good, but there is a saying, the British hospitality stops at the front door. Whereas in
yes,
South Africa, it's just Mikasa Sukasa is like my house is always like a railway station, and that is how we
yes,
are, but it's not like that. Yeah, the culture is vastly different, and that's why I get
yeah,
aggrieved when I get told on social media, go back to Europe, because I'm not
mm,
European anymore. I'm white, but
yes,
I'm just South African. The way
yes,
I think, the way I operate, my attitude towards life is just South African. It is not European. I just happen to have a white skin.
yes, yeah. So as I say, I'm quite glad that you raised that point because I think South Africa is very unique in the different subcultures that we have in this country, for lack of a better word.
Mm.
I mean, people will look at the 1820 settlers and say, but they were the land grabbers. They were the people that came and took our land. And, these were hostile people. And yes, I've said in the book, that the British Empire at the time was hostile. I mean, they went all over the world. They went into India, they went into Africa.
Yeah.
The Belgians went into Africa, the French went into Africa, and they did what they
Then
wanted.
during the
I mean,
height of imperialism, they owned a third of the world or something, wasn't it?
yeah. So as I say to you, it was a hostile empire. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna, try to defend that. But if we go back prior to that, the Italians or the Romans were also very hostile.
Mm.
Genghis Khan, who took over most of Europe at a point, was also very hostile. We've had these hostilities, throughout history. And to try and insinuate, that this was the only society that really suffered under imperialism and under hostility and invasion, or whatever you'd like to call it, is a fallacy. Because
Yeah.
if you
Well, the
look at what the
Ottoman
British,
Empire was
yeah,
made the the British Empire look like, saints, really.
yeah. So, as I say to you, we've got all these scenarios all over the world, and I raise this topic of imperialism, of invasion, of empire in the book. Because of my ancestors, well, actually, part of my 1820 British settlers were actually Irish. uh, they came out on their own ship. There's always been a little bit of discrimination between
Oh,
the
yes.
Irish and the English, not a
The
bit,
Irish
a lot.
hate the English,
Yeah.
but hate.
Well, I
If you
mean,
thought the Afrikaners hated the English, it pales in comparison to what the Irish feel towards the English, and justifiably
yeah.
so, because I have
Yeah.
delved into that, and what they did to the
Mm.
Irish was absolutely deplorable.
Well, Nicole, many years ago, I had some Irish friends out there, and I took them, they wanted to see a bit of the Afrikaner culture and the history. So I took them to the Anglo-Boer War um, monument in Bloemfontein.
Hmm.
And on the one wall was a massive mural of how the Irish helped the Boers in the Anglo-Boer War. There weren't very many of them. I think it was about 200 or 400, like some Russians also did. I mean, not
Yes.
many people would actually know that. But so just to come back to the point, not to diverge too far off the point, but what I then found out is that, you can't pigeonhole people and say, well, he's from 1820 settler stock
Yeah.
because I've got Dutch stock in me. And there is more and more writing that a lot of the original Dutch are not white, quote unquote. I mean, Simon van der Stel's mother had Indian in her. She had
Hmm.
Indian genetics in her.
Yes.
And I read a very interesting thing not so long ago that if it was the years of apartheid, Simon van der Stel could possibly have been termed a colored person. Now, and if you go back and you look at Afrikaner culture and Afrikaner history, he's a revered person. I mean, he's got places named after him in Stellenbosch and
Yeah.
in Cape Town. So, we've got this feeling that we like to find a group that we can hammer.
Yeah.
Let's hammer the English. If you come from Britain, you're bad because you were empire and you took the world over. You took a third of the world over. But it's not always that simple. It's not always that, Shane Brody is an Englishman because I'm not. I've got lots of different types of people in me, lots of types of different ethnicities in me. And I also raise the fact in my book, that if you look what happened to the Irish in the potato famine
Yeah.
in the mid 1800s, I mean, half of that country basically was either displaced or they died.
Yeah.
And what happened at the time is that a lot of the food which was available in Ireland got shipped off to Britain because of the absentee landlords. I mean, these people were basically serfs. So when we look at the history of discrimination, if we look at apartheid, if we look at a lot of bad systems in the world, it's not only centered on South Africa. But what I mention in my book is that a lot of the fighting in South Africa and the modern narrative has been turned into a black versus white narrative.
Absolutely. But it's the
Now
same
that
as the narrative about the fact that it was only black people that were displaced from land during apartheid. You cover in your book the fact that your family lost their land during
yeah.
apartheid.
So I was going to build up onto that point. So what then transpired is that I had this family that landed in Albany. I had this family which had been here a lot longer because one of my 1820 settler ancestors married a Dutch woman. He was actually married 3 times because in those years people used to die, quite regularly. So
Hmm.
he married this Dutch woman. He had a number of children with her. He married a second woman who was from English stock. She actually died in a veld fire, which was a very common thing in Albany.
Hmm.
She was in her mid-30s when she died. I think, he had 2 or 3 children with her. Then he married a third woman who was actually a sister to his son-in-law from his first marriage. So, so,
Okay.
so this ancestor of mine, who's a very
Going on there.
well-known guy in the Albany area, um, he eventually had 20 children. So
Oh,
I've got just from that ancestor, I've got a very big family tree. So what then transpired is that as as the settlers moved up into the interior, and I also cover this in my book, it often gets put across that this expansion into the interior, other side of the Fish River, because you may have heard that originally the boundary between the Xhosa and the settlers was the Great Fish River.
Mm-hmm.
So at the time of the Cape Colony, there was such turmoil here and such a difficulty in how to govern that I think the colony had about 25 governors just for this region. You can go to guys like Benjamin de Urban, you can go to the original one, Lord Charles Somerset, and none of them actually knew how to govern. So what Somerset did is that he made a cedar territory between the settlers and the Xhosa. It was on that side of the Fish River, and he said no one will live there. That we're only going to have military forts there. So this became a bone of contention, because it was almost like a segregation system. And as new governors came in, and then some very interesting politics started occurring in Britain where the Tories lost the elections and the Whig Party came into power. Now, the Whig Party would be almost like Labour at the moment. It's now defunct, so it no longer exists. But they were actually very anti the colony and empire, and, they were not conservative, in other words.
No. Well, that was when the dismantling of the empires really started in the UK.
Yes.
The pulling out.
So what actually transpired is that there was a guy called Lord Glenelg. He was a very liberal man in the British Parliament. He was the Minister of the Colonies. And he wanted to pull as much support for the settlers out as he could, because he wasn't in favor of this. Because at the time, Harry Smith was planning to make towns in Queenstown and in King Williamstown and wherever. So I'm not going to go too much into detail into that. If people want to learn more about it, they can actually read it in the book. But just to cut a long story short, so what happened is that we had a guy called Piet Retief, who you will all know about, who built a lot of the buildings in Grahamstown and who farmed at Post Retief, which was just a little bit north of Grahamstown. So what then occurred is that Andri Stockenstrom, who was from Dutch stock, eventually became the governor, of the territory. And he did away with the cedar territory because he was, the Whig Party liked this guy. And he seemed to have changed from being quite a conservative guy to being quite a liberal guy. So he did away with the cedar territory. And if you go back to people like Jeremiah Goldswain, who was a famous settler, and you read his diaries, he says that because that cedar territory or that neutral territory was done away with, cattle raiding, which tended to occur quite often amongst Xhosa ethnic groups and Zulu ethnic groups. If you were a stronger group, you'd go raid cattle from a weaker group.
Yeah.
These cattle raids started occurring more and more into Albany. And at one stage, 115,000 cattle were raided and taken over the Fish River, deep into what they called Xhosa territory, which is into the region which is now Butterworth. So Piet Retief then said, well, I can no longer live here because this cedar territory was like almost keeping the peace between us and the Xhosa. So he actually then started the Great Trek. So it is a very, very, what occurred in the Eastern Cape then had very profound effects on what happened in a South Africa to come. Because he then got murdered by Tingane, in that infamous meeting of theirs. Then Andries Pretorius came onto the scene at the Battle of Blood River. Then the Boers tried to annex Natal, and the English under Shepstone, under Theophilus Shepstone, went and defeated them there. Then they moved up into the interior and they formed the two Boer republics, which was the Free State and the Transvaal, which would have more than likely never have happened if Piet Retief had never, made up his mind to do the Great Trek. So all these little historical junctures and pivotal moments are mentioned in my book, which actually molded what was going to occur in South Africa. And
And do you
then
think the Eastern Cape was basically the launching point for a lot of what we experience now in South Africa in
it is
terms of our
certain,
historical context?
it is certainly so, and this is why I say that the Eastern Cape was a cauldron. It was a place of high emotion, lots of conflict. I mean, there were 9 frontier wars, of which only the last 5 involved the English settlers. The previous ones, the previous 4 was between basically some earlier English groups and the Dutch and the Khoisan. So
Mm.
you've got all these wars which were occurring over 100 years. Then you've got a very interesting dynamic that comes up, which I mentioned in my book, is that people like who eventually became Sir Harry Smith, who is accredited, quite unquote, with having crushed, the Xhosa eventually. He comes onto the scene and he goes and he builds King Williamstown. He goes and he builds East London, Fort Glamorgan, which was a fort first, and then it became a city. And then he expands. He expands into deeper Xhosa territories. And later places like Ngcobo came and Mthatha came. But to come back to Andries Stockenstrom, who did away with the ceded territory, he was convinced that to have treaties with the Xhosa chiefs, not to raid into Albany and to try have this friendship, it didn't work because the Xhosa chiefs viewed that as a weakness. And you must understand that a lot of those chiefs at the time were unaccustomed to having things like treaties, and because a lot of, if you go back and you look at the Mfetane, which was called the crushing, it was when Zulu groups or Xhosa groups or whatever used to raid each other. And Shaka had kicked out Mzilikazi because Mzilikazi had raided cattle from another group and had not given them to Shaka. So Shaka basically wanted him dead. So he went over the Drakensberg. If you go look at historical records, he actually wiped out a lot of tribes there. He took the young men and their women and formed his own people, which then became the Ndebele people. So
Well,
he
didn't the
moved further into.
Zulus consider the Xhosa of a lower caste system? They used to be the people that used to clean up their toilets or something like that.
Yeah, well, not really. You've got a clan system in the Xhosa that are called the Batas, that
Right.
traditionally, the other Xhosa, not looked down upon, but when you come to that, type of a narrative, so you've got these various clans, of which there are many, just within the Xhosa people. You've got various clans to within the Zulu people.
Is
But
that
to
what
explain
affects
to
our
what then
politics
happened,
today, tribalism? Do you think that that is the reason why we can have no cohesion in our country now? Because basically tribalism still rules.
well, Nicole, let me put it this way. It's very difficult not to look at the fact that there are more than 10 big ethnic groups in South Africa. I mean, you've got the Zulu, the Xhosa, the Vendas, the Sothos, and this whole narrative that, the whole of Southern Africa should belong to anyone who comes from Africa. If you come from Europe, you've got no place here, but if you come anywhere from Africa, you've got place here. But that narrative is broken down when you look at xenophobia in South Africa. So if a person comes from Malawi or comes from Zimbabwe, there's this feeling that he shouldn't be here because he's not from here. So what I also raise in my book is that Pan-Africanism suits people when it suits them.
Yeah.
So if you come from anywhere in Africa, you've got title to land here. But then what about the Malawians that come and the Zimbabweans who come and the Kenyans that come and the Somalians and whoever, they've got no place here. There's
Because I
this whole
think
narrative now,
the
this
narrative,
whole narrative now that they should go home. They don't believe
yeah,
it. They're taking out jobs, they're opening up businesses. So it's a very difficult thing to decipher and to work out. Because as I explained to you, so, the narrative is that it was only the Europeans or the Dutch who came in here and it created a problem.
Yeah.
So, and they did create problems in certain instances. I'm also not going to, I'm not going to deny that. I mean, I maintain in my book too, or not, I've got no proof to prove it, but I ask the question is that weren't the 1820 settlers sent here just as a buffer? No, weren't they sent here just to be workers for the richer classes? Were they not sent up into the interior to form these little towns,
Well, the
to assist
diaspora
guys like
to
Cecil
get
John
Britain
Rhodes?
out. Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
it
to
was a
expand the
case of
empire.
we need the empire, we need the British out there. We need let's send all the sort of a small little criminals, you're sort of we'll send them to
Yes,
Australia. I mean, Australia
yeah,
started out as an area where they used to send your petty thieves, stole
yes.
a loaf of bread or something like that. You were shipped off to Australia to form a colony. Why not? Shane, I'm going to be ending up now because we're nearly at 40 minutes. So I kind
No
of
problem.
divide them into 40-minute segments. So let's try and have a look and see. So, what, in your view, is the most important part of South Africa's historical context that puts us in the position where we are at the moment, considering
Mm.
the conflict that we have in South Africa and the problems that we have in South Africa? What is it about our history that is the most relevant?
Right, Nicole, I was actually about to mention that fact about my parents who then lived in the Transkei region, what then became the Transkei region, and they had their properties expropriated twice,
Yeah,
to make way, for the Transkei homeland. So that created big problems for my family, for also thousands of other farmers who were bought out, which I will go into in our second interview. But the problem for me is that, we've got this narrative that if you are this ethnicity, you are bad. If you are
yeah,
this one, you're a victim. I mean, I can call on lots of victimhoods because my dad comes from orphans, my mother's mother, my grandmother comes from orphans. I come from Jews that left under the pogroms in Europe. So,
yeah,
I come from the Irish who were starved in the potato famines. So I can
yeah.
always go back and say, but I should be helped because I come from this type of a narrative.
Yeah, well, I
So the
come from
problem,
Welsh coal miners. They used to send
yes,
our kids down at 9 and 10 years old. Nobody
mm,
made it beyond the age of 30 because of black lung disease. So, I
yes,
mean, I remember my great grandparents. There were 10 of them who lived in a room, which they had to pay rent to the
mm,
landed gentry. So, I mean, I come
yes,
from poor, poverty stricken stock. So I could
yeah,
also hate, the English because of what
yeah,
they did to the Welsh, because of the coal miners and
yeah,
stuff. So we need to get away from that, though.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. Nicole, I'm not saying forget the past, and I'm not saying
No,
that there should be some form of an assistance for people who have been through a tough time. But all that I'm saying is that we can't forever in perpetuity live with expecting that, we're always going to be put on a pedestal if we've got the capacity or if we've got the knowledge or what. If you look at our education system in this country, it has almost fallen to pieces. Now, how do you expect a people who have been historically disadvantaged to ever get anywhere if they aren't being well educated?
well, I
So,
think the ANC
it's
doesn't
all
want
these,
them educated because an
yeah, so
educated
it's all these
populace would
little
vote
things.
them out.
It's all these little things which we'll cover more in the second interview, but
Yeah.
all these things are interrelated. We want this furtherance and we want this transformation, but if you're not investing into that, if you go look at what Robert Kumede said, that 1 trillion rand went to 100 people in South Africa
Yeah.
under the guise of BEE. What if that 1 trillion rand had been given to the 5 million black entrepreneurs that were existent in South Africa in 1994? How
Yeah.
many good businesses wouldn't you have today? You probably have 20 million good businesses. Why
We
wasn't that
wouldn't,
done?
yeah, we wouldn't have 21
So my
million
problem is
people
that you ask me
on
what is the
welfare.
problem? Yeah, so you ask me what is the problem which I see in the country? The problem is that people are not looking at their past. and they're not understanding what is being done to them. But they're so caught up in the race narrative, in the ethnic narrative, that these are the scapegoats, these are the people who are causing our problems. If people don't see past that or can't see past that, the problems of this country will never come right.
Yeah. We need to understand our history if we want to understand where we should be going in our future. Shane, thanks very much. This was fantastic. As I said,
Thank you,
as you've
Nicole.
alluded to, there are going to be two parts to this interview. The book is so long and it is so good that I decided that one interview wasn't enough. So we're going to do a two-part. In the second part, I think we need to return to the land issue. It is a very contentious issue in South Africa. But in my experience, from not only having read your book, but having done some of my own research, the land issue is completely misunderstood in South Africa. And the narrative that the ANC propagates with regard to the land issue is a complete lie. And in fact, the majority have been lied to. The majority of the issues around land are propaganda. That's it. And I think that it's very important, if we are to have a future in South Africa, that we clear up the issue of land. Who owns land? Who has a right to land? Who took the land? And who actually should have land on a huge basis? And the catastrophic effects that it's going to have if we need to subdivide this land into tiny portions so that 60 million people have the land the size of a tall. So I'd like to come back to that next week, Shane, if that's okay, in our next episode, part 2.
A last thing I'd just like to say leading up to the next interview is that I was born and raised in the Transkei region. isiXhosa was the first language I ever spoke. I could only speak English from the age of 4. So I can read it fluently, I can write it fluently. I grew up in the homeland communal farming system. I studied Xhosa at university level, at high school level on the high grade. I've got 12 years of experience in mentoring communal farmers. So I know the dynamics. So I'm not speaking from a theorist, I'm not speaking from an ivory tower. I'm speaking from experience lived.
Yeah.
And I think folk need to understand that, is that we've got lots of these theorists out there that come with all these fancy programs and fancy ways to solve the problems. But I speak from a lived experience. And we'll go further into that in the next one.
That'd be
that
great.
folk can understand where I come from, who I am, that I'm not this guy that has read up all these things in books.
Yeah. Well, we need to speak to more people who are on the ground. We need to speak to more people who actually have experience. We've got too many people in politics who actually have no experience whatsoever, dictating to those people who do have experience. And I think that's probably the crux of South Africa's problems, is that those in power don't know what they're doing, and those underneath do know what they're doing, and they don't get the opportunity or the money to do what needs to be done for this country. But Shane, thanks for your time now. Like I said, please, everybody, stick around for part 2, because that's really going to be explosive. We're going to go into the book far more in-depthly, and we'll take it to the next level. Thanks, Shane.
Thank you, Nicole.
To my listeners, thank you for joining me. If you found this discussion thought-provoking, help us keep the conversation going. Hit that follow button on Spotify, and don't forget to connect with me on X, formerly Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, stay curious.